It's rich. Sistahship, we got this on a brothership unite. Sistahship, we got this on a brothership unite. Sistahship, we got this on a brothership unite. Sistahship, we got this Bro, you know we on a mission, let's go. Yeah, I'm on a Sistahship show. Teach us everything you know. Come on, so we help each other grow. That's how our communities flow.
All right. Happy October, everyone. Happy October. I am hoping everyone's doing well, and we have a really interesting show topic, and we have a guest on the Brothaship. So before we get into it, I just want to introduce the panel. We have Bruce Berry, we have Jerry Jude, we have Bay Bullock, and our guest today is Terry Pickering.
Yep, Pickering, yep.
And I'm your host, Darren Johnson, or co-host. And today we have a very interesting topic that when we lay out our topics in the future with the Brothaship, we kind of plan them ahead. And the topic of voting rights came up. And I think we're at an inflection point in America with respect to voting rights. And our intent today is just to kind of talk about, you know, the history of voting in America, and then kind of just have what should be an interesting discussion around our thoughts around voting. You know, does voting really matter? Does it make a difference? What can we do constructively to move ahead the concept of voting? Is voting archaic? All of those topics and more, hopefully we can scratch the surface on and have a meaningful dialogue. But before we get into that, I think any discussion around voting must necessitate some type of history, because, you know, we're living in interesting times right now where there's been this back and forth and, dare I say, misinformation propagated and arguably some misunderstanding. So let's start with a short timeline of voting in America so that we can begin to intelligently talk about the current state and its future. As we all know, America was conceived in 1776 via, you know, a collection of meetings and acts formalizing the Declaration of Independence. But at that time, voting was controlled by individual state legislatures. And the only people that were allowed to vote at that time in 1776 were white men that were 21 or older who owned land. So agrarian landowners were the first people that could vote, no one else, okay? Over time, obviously, the issue of slavery created such division in the United States that the Civil War broke out. And obviously, as we tried to reconstruct the country, there was I'll say a push for all people to vote. And in 1868, the 14th Amendment had granted all men voting rights that were born or neutralized in the United States. But there was a problem with that. Because that was an amendment to our Constitution, not everyone felt that others were guaranteed that right. That's even in our legal book. So a lot of bad things happened. Things like terrorist acts, lynching, voter intimidation, and barriers that attempted to disenfranchise voters. So in 1870, between that time, things had gotten so bad, the 15th Amendment was ratified to eliminate racial barriers to voting. That's the law, but unfortunately, many other states continued practicing voter discrimination through poll taxes, literacy tests, fraud, and outright intimidation to prevent voting. And at that time, Native Americans still hadn't gotten the right to vote along with women. So we go maybe another 40, 50 years, and the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote. So when we look at 1920, at this point, everybody was still allegedly given the right to vote, but the terroristic acts and voter discrimination and suppression still was very pervasive. So much to the point that in 1964, the Federal Civil Rights Act was passed to ensure that all men and women aged 21 or older, regardless of race, religion, or education, had the right to vote. Now, those are key points. And right now we're in 2022. And to kick this off, we had a federal civil rights bill in 1964, but ever since then, and I was born in 1966, we've still had this issue around voter suppression, and we've had this issue around voting rights. And after the 2020 election, without getting into too much detail, we obviously saw a president that was the incumbent lose, but create what many are calling the big lie that's fostered over 360 laws over 40 states to change voting rights as we've looked at it. So I'm going to stop there and open this up with the question of simply, do you think there still are barriers to voting?
I definitely believe that there's still barriers to voting, not only set forth by outside parties, these laws that are starting to change and things like that, but I think there's barriers within ourselves, and talking about the African American people. There's barriers within ourselves because not everybody goes and votes. Not everybody goes and supports. So not only are we getting hit from the outside, we're getting hit from inside too.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I guess I'm gonna jump on that one, and I think those barriers, Bruce, are set up or are there because of, I guess the last president, the prime example, how you have these 370, as you mentioned, Darren, some odd laws to change the laws. So, you know, as Black people, what's happening and what continues to happen is we're running this race. And every time we lose or they lose, they move the line. And so I can understand why people are disheartened in terms of voting, because, you know, we had it with the other election, you know, somebody won the popular vote but lost the electoral. And I do want to touch on the electoral later on down the road. But I think it's disheartening, and I guess we've got to figure out a way to draw that line in the sand and leave it there.
I agree with you 100%, Jerry. I mean, and like Darren said, we've been able to vote since 1964, and nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. So, what is the benefit, in my opinion, of voting? Because we've had this opportunity since '64, and all we have dealt with is racist president, a whole racist system. So there comes a time when you just say, forget it, I got to try something else, because that's the definition of insanity. You know, it's definitely the definition. And I was born in '64, so my whole life, you know, I had the opportunity to vote, and I've never seen nothing good come out of it on the presidential scale, the Senate, all that. Locally, I think we should vote, definitely. And then, you know, city council, stuff like that, mayor and stuff like that, because you can hold those people accountable. You know, but I just don't see holding what Biden's doing now with the Afghanis, giving one of them $6 billion to the Afghani refugees. Well, what did we get? And we're not refugees. We were here. We were here when they got here.
You got a point there.
Okay, I was hoping that we would get to that further into the show, and it's a good segue. And for full transparency to the audience, when we talked about this, we obviously have divergent views. So I'll pose it from the standpoint of not necessarily consensus, because I think that there's a mindset among us, and I'll share mine. Voting does make things happen, because when we look at let's just say housing, for example, there was just at one point, and there still is, it's the game has just changed, where there was overt housing discrimination, redlining, for example. I know people in my family in the northern part of the country, Long Island, for example, Newark, for example, that were unable to purchase homes even if they had the down payment or they had the credit score, because there were what they call covenants put in place to exclude specific groups of people. Now, that is why voting becomes a seminal part of making change, because at one point, just because it's legal doesn't make it morally right. And segregation was a significant part of the African-American experience after Reconstruction, because people got together and decided through disenfranchisement of voting to create laws to exclude that minority group. So when we start at that base level, I think that, that's the reason why our ancestors fought and died for the right to vote. I have members of my family that actually participated in the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina at Woolworths, because at the time it was legal to say to someone that looked like us, you can't go to the front of Woolworths and get a hot dog. Scram. So, when we talk about how voting changes, up until that point, people got together to say that's morally wrong. And I think, unfortunately, what tends to happen when we look at just what we want as far as equity or civil rights, people on both sides can misconstrue it as us asking for something other than just the humanity of what everyone else has. So there's the case for voting back then. Now, fast forward to 2021, I agree from my personal politics that both political parties have not done their best to look at equality. But then if we don't look at history through the prism of it repeating itself, if we don't coalesce and use voting as a leverage to get people that don't have our best interests, if we don't keep them from out of office, we are going to potentially bring the same type of behaviors and legislation back into our existence, if that makes sense.
Well, I just want to jump in right quick. I want to back up just a little bit because I agree with everybody's statements and comments in regards to voting. And I can understand how in the Black community, we are so upset and disenfranchised with voting and not seeing enough progress happening. But I must say, how can you win a race against a system that has had at least a 500-year head start? How do you catch up? And we have to fix that perception from within. We have to change perception within. We have to educate our children to fill some of those voids and become politicians, become lawyers, so we can be put in position for us to elect them to help make that change. And that way, voting will come a little more easier and more reasonable to our views and our opinions. Because right now, the current system is, there's so many distractions that's been put in our way. You know, you got the Democrats ain't doing what they're supposed to do. Republicans ain't doing what they're supposed to do. The independents ain't strong enough. Forget the Green Party, right? So we have to create a new system, you know, and we have to be a part of the creation of the new system, in my opinion. That's my 2 cents, and y'all can keep the change.
I think, you know, in piggybacking off of that, I mean, I think that's totally correct. That is what needs to be done. But unfortunately, the older generation, our ages, you know, mid 50s, you know, late 40s, whatever, they do have that mentality to do it. It's that younger generation now.
Yes.
Those ones who just voted. See, they are a society of instant gratification.
Right.
That's why social media is so popular with them. How many likes can I get? I talk to my athletes all the time. I said, you'd rather get a like from somebody you don't even know than listen to a person who knows you and cares about you. So that's where the issue is coming in, because it does fall down to well, tink, tink, I voted. So what happens now? We have to wait? Nah, it ain't about that. I need it done now, because if I post something, I get a like right back. It's instant gratification. That's where the issue is starting to come in with that younger generation. We, as the older ones, we know it's going to take time to change the system. The younger ones, they like, hey, man, I ain't even worried about it. They're going to go out, they want to march, they want to protest, they want to do this, they need to see instant results. That's where our problem is coming in.
Absolutely, I concur.
We're phasing out. We're the older bunch. So that instant gratification is going to be the new thing. Because you got to remember, each generation replaces the older generation with their own way of living. You know what I'm saying? So, and if they want that instant gratification, granted, they want that instant gratification because they took the time in the society that they built to do the little click that they want to do. So they want to get what they want to get. And it's like 50 years, or I'm 57. So 57 years of going to the voting box and then moving the goalposts, playing games with us, not giving us what we want, or even a fraction of what we need. And it's like, when does it stop? You know, and I'm not saying I have an answer, but you got to identify the problem first, and then you can find the answer. Just like Terry said, you know, it's something that has to be worked out with the newer generation, or was that Bruce? It's just the newer generation, I think, is going to come out and just change everything, because they're much faster and they want something right away for what they did.
Well,
you know, we're taught to wait.
Well, and just to get back on this voting thing, and I think we'll start to peel the onion back. One of the interesting things, and Jerry alluded to kind of the electoral piece, because while I agree that this starts at a local level, I want to just pan out a little bit to look at the implications of 2020, because what we don't realize is that, you know, first, and this is just my opinion, in 2016, the climate was set arguably for the most qualified candidate on paper to lose, and that was Hillary Clinton. Now, I didn't think that she could win. I'm going to just keep it real, and I'll tell you why. Because I am into politics. I followed it as a kid, just watching races and understanding the numbers behind it. And I can tell you, when it was determined that she would be the candidate, the propaganda, and that's a large part of the politics that we're engaged with right now. You know, the Benghazi piece, I'll say the rumors. We've garnered more conspiracy theory over the past 10 years in our politics than we have ever, arguably, in American political history. But let me just share a few facts, because we all know that a candidate needs 270 electoral votes to win a presidential election. But because of the dispersion of electoral votes, it actually comes down to less than 5 to 6 states. And what actually happened in 2020 was a higher representation of minority votes in 3 states, Georgia, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So when we look at the numbers aggregately, more African Americans came out in 2020 than 2016. So 63% of African Americans came out versus 60%. The Asian community, it was 10%, 59% versus 49%. And for Hispanics, that number went from 48% in 2016 to 54%. So the quote unquote browning of America and the shifting demographics that's been verified by the census show that we're there. And that all but validates this nonsense we're seeing with all of these changing goalposts, as Jerry alluded to make it harder for us to get to the polls. So I go back to my initial ideology, not voting in the current aggressive climate that we're in to disenfranchise us is not the answer. And my passion is that, you know, we know right now, I'd say, you know, in the Obama era, we thought, or we were even trying to be sold that, you know, hope and change. And I think people told the lie and they just suppressed that anger. And in less than 8 years, it became an overt extreme in terms of the politics of the right to continue to disenfranchise and even just actually have a relentless assault on truth to promote that agenda.
I guess what I want to throw out there is the electoral college still needed? And I did see something in the chat that I also want to throw out there while you guys are pondering, responding about the electoral college. And it was, I'm sorry. It said many older people are tired to continue to fight and too many younger people don't give a damn. I want to address that because I don't think that's true. I think, like Bay said, I think they are a immediate gratification generation, and so their thing doesn't line up with the older generation, right? They're not fighting for the same thing the older generation is fighting for, and so there is a disconnect. And so I guess part of figuring out how to fix this voting, like Terry alluded to, was we've got to figure out a new way to do this, that the goalposts can't be moved, that everybody is heard for what they want. Because like Bay said, you know, locally you can hold politicians, you know, accountable. But once you start moving to state and the federal level, it's harder to hold their feet to the fire. But the problem is we're not demanding they be held to the fire as a group, right? You know, you might have the older people who are saying, you know, this doesn't benefit senior citizens. Well, you know, the millennials really ain't fighting for the senior citizens right now, right? Because they're talking about right now, like, how can they survive today? And you're trying to figure out how to move the retirement age from 72 to 75. Of course, everybody's not going to fight for that right now. It doesn't affect everybody. So I guess just bringing a truth platform like we had back in the 60s and letting our representatives stand on that. And I think that's where we need to start is getting a platform to stand on. And then this way we have those checkbox to say, here are the things that we want from you. And we're going to hold you accountable for these things. And as a group agree on whatever those things are.
I think that, well said. I think that's the intermediary part. But at the base level, if we talk about voter apathy, first we have to condition the young minds on the importance of voting. I think that gets lost. Now, again, I'm a history buff, and I can tell you that, you know, when we look at just say Germany, pre-Hitler, the climate that we're experiencing today is one that's very similar. It's alarmingly similar.
Very similar.
Because
yes.
you have the majority of people that were disenfranchised that were the majority. And you had one person that had a charismatic ability to sell the story. And that's what politics is about. Let's keep it real. It's selling the story. I mean, Barack Obama sold the story on hope. And actually, as an African-American, I've told people then, I said, do not expect much from him if you expect him to do this, that, or the other for the African community, because
Hey,
that's
Darren.
not his job. His job was to be the American president and to stay in power for 8 years as he did. There couldn't be that much transparency and quote unquote bringing it home.
But Darren, how can you say that when with every president does something for every certain group? How could he not do something for his own group?
Because
and he's not really, he's not FBA. But why couldn't he do something for African American? I don't see how we can even excuse that.
Because I'm not excusing it. I'm not even justifying it. I'm sharing that as a person that spent over 30 years in corporate America leading groups, knowing that you have to be as transparent with everyone. You have to do things that are outside of what's the line of sight. So, some of his organizations that he's done has helped people. The fact that they broke ground on his presidential library in the south side of Chicago against everybody's wishes and making sure that all of the people that were part of the architecture, the actual construction, and the actual execution of that project are people of, minority ethnicity. So again, I'm just saying that because here's how that works. If you're in a position of power, you're always going to have to understand and navigate that way. You can be a revolutionary at heart, but in no way can you show that, or else the coup begins. And
but then you're in that system, so you're not really working that system the way you should be working. You should start your own system. What Terry just said, you have to start something new, because you can't be in a system that's been around for all of this time and think that you're actually going to change it. Nothing's going to change. And we brought up redlining, and we brought up all these different conditions that we dealt with before. We're still dealing with that. We're still dealing with slavery. We're still dealing with redlining. We're still dealing with inequality on jobs. Everything is still the same. Nothing's changed. They just hide it more.
Okay, I'll throw this out here. And again, and this is where we have to have these conversations. Barack Obama did something that Donald Trump or Joe Biden couldn't do. And knowing what he had to deal with when people after his election said they would do everything in their power to make him a one-term president, which they failed at, he passed healthcare. These guys, the past two folks, haven't been able to pass infrastructure. They've done nothing with respect to doing stuff for the American people. So strip out the special interests, but that was something that nobody was able to do. And that's going to, down the line, be looked at as a mandate that couldn't be changed. Look at the assault that they tried to do for healthcare. They called it Obamacare to condition those less informed in rural areas that it was a bad thing.
Yeah,
and
in middle America, yeah.
It took when they were actually within votes to appeal it at the first few months of the Trump presidency. They almost had it until people in Kentucky and Mississippi and West Virginia said, "You mean American health care is Obamacare?" And they flipped. So I'm just saying, when we talk about a politician, his main job is to legislate for the people. That dude, when I just look at the scorecard, he did something that no one else, at least since his landmark decision, has been able to do.
But also, Darren, under his administration, more Black folks were killed. That was another thing that happened. And he dropped more bombs on more people. He killed Gaddafi. That wasn't right.
I wholeheartedly agree with everyone, and I think we're digressing from the voting. I agree. Once you get to that level, Darren, you're correct. It is, you've got to do for the greater good, right? It's hard to hold. We all wanted, Obama to get in and change the course of American history, right? We wanted,
He did that though.
See, and yeah, I agree. No, let's stop there.
Not to the satisfaction of everyone, right? A lot of people wanted him to correct the wrongs of institutional racism while he being in office. And we knew that couldn't happen. Well,
Wasn't going to happen
some
in
of
8
us knew
years.
that couldn't happen. And he could not address that and still move the needle, like Darren said, on healthcare. You can't fight both battles, right? You can't move the needle and right the wrongs, because like Darren said, the coup will begin at some point. And so let's get back to, I guess, voting, because we can digress all day about what he did and didn't do. But Darren, you mentioned something that, again, you went back to the 60s and talked about how everybody came together. But I think that's the issue. They had something that bound everyone together, young, old. It was their color. It was the way Black people were getting treated, that we all stood together. We don't have that anymore. We don't have a civil rights leader who's saying, here are some things that, here's our agenda. What's bothering, people down in Georgia is not bothering people out in the Midwest. And so what you have is a fractured country. And so, of course, you're going to have fractured politics, right? Because there's no one overall agenda to move the needle forward.
Well, let me just jump in right quick.
Go ahead, John.
One thing that was very important during the 60s in the civil rights movement was that we had our civil rights leaders, and we also had the foundation of the Black church. They worked hand in hand. And current day, our Black leaders aren't as popular and as strong as they was in the 60s, because again, there's not a common goal. Like you said, depends on where you live at in the country, your fight is different, right? But the common thing that we all had that brought everybody together in the 60s was the Black church. And the Black church has fell apart because everybody's flying a flag and they're all preaching prosperity. And it's all about business as opposed to community, So where young people, middle-aged people, and older people can get the same message at the same time, at the same place, we don't have that system or structure in place anymore, because we had one place to go. Remember, prior to the civil rights movement, the Black church served the purpose of the community. That was your daycare, your food pantry, your employment agency, your housing. Everything went to the Black church. They gave us civil rights, food stamps, and a housing projects. That was our 40 acres and our mule. They gave us that, and they said, you don't got to do that anymore. They took all that power away from the Black church. The Black church fell into the hands of crooks, so to speak. So all those things that was our building blocks in the Black community that helped us with voting and the advancement of Black people or people of color went out the window. So now you got these pastors, all these churches with 30, 40, 50,000 people, pastors buying planes and mega mansions and all sort of stuff. It's about money and not about the people. There's not enough churches. There's no foundation to go back and say, we need to find a common ground for the people, because the politicians can't do it. You know what I mean? And our children are smitten by what they hear. We can't close our ear gate. We can close our eyes. And these young kids today, what they hear in the music is horrible. If the rappers say don't vote, the kids ain't gonna vote because their favorite rapper said don't vote. That's who we're raising our children, and that's the mindset we got to change. We got to go back a little further and deeper. We know what happened with the Black church. We know what happened with the weakness of our politicians. We have to find a new way to get these kids, and it's what they see and hear. Pop culture is what we have to change and shape to get back on point, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Well, I think that's the most important word that you said, D. I didn't mean to cut you off. That's the most important word that you said is we. We've turned from a we to a me society now.
Yes.
That's what it has become. We had a common goal in the 60s. We had to come together to get something done. Now it's me. It's what I'm going to do. Let's look at the titles and the sensitivity of America, period. has come down to, well, it has hurt my feelings. It is me. We've become a me generation and not a we anymore. And I think that is one of the main catalysts of why people aren't getting out to vote. Because if we come together and vote, we can make a change. But I don't give two red nickels about what is happening there because it's not affecting me. So we has turned to me, which has turned to almost craziness now.
Which is why I'm very passionate about this issue of voting, because, you know, if I looked at it along the terms of me, I could just say I have everything that I want and that's fine. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I was always taught as a kid, you might wind up making something of yourself, or you may become a janitor, but whatever you are, be the best you can be and always be my brother's keeper, regardless. So it doesn't even have to be the material thing. It's looking at what's right or wrong. And I mean, I'm sorry, that's how I operate. You know, we're seeing a lot of things that are morally wrong. Now, the difference between my politics and the politics of the right, from what I'm seeing, is that we actually have a political party in America that's operating from cognitive dissonance and actually unwilling to accept the realities that are within America, a changing America, an America that really is unhappy collectively, regardless of race, of their economic issue. That's why grievance is a selling point to the dominant caste. They're no better off than they were before. They're just being led to believe that they're losing something because of something else, which is what riles people up, which is what causes extremism, which perpetuates violence. So where I'm going from is that as a people, you're right, we have to cut through that nonsense and forget the materialism, to forget the meism, and look at the direct threat. You know, I don't worry about the Taliban. I worry about Bobby and the minivan, if you know what I'm saying. You know, we're at an inflection point when we talk about why we need to vote. This is the first time in our generation where domestic terrorism is being called out from the FBI. You know what I mean? And you're starting to even see at just other levels, just observing things. You know, people aren't being held to the same standard that other people are. This Gabby Petito gal that went missing, we saw an actual, in real time, he popped her in the mouth. Once she went missing, said that, you know, the guy said he wasn't going to speak to the police. The family was even stone-faced. They find the body and now they can't find him. You see what I'm saying? I mean, that is insane. And that's, you know, same race, crime on crime. What happens when, you know, people start feeling that, again, and this was once written by a Supreme Court justice in America jurisprudence, there are no rights with which a white man is, you know, held accountable for when it pertains to a black man. That's why we have to start, you know, looking at the direction we're going. And again, Malcolm X once said, the ballot or the bullet. I contend to you, we're not ready to go there with armed struggle. So the only other way that you have to do that is to come together. And it's not just quote unquote us. That's why I shared that statistic around, you know, Asian and even Latina, because you have to win this, have a cross ethnic and even economic coalition to win for the greater good. That's just my opinion.
Yeah.
It sucks, Darren.
Say again?
Bay, you funny, man. You funny.
I'm just kidding, man. I'm just kidding. No, you know, I don't know, man. I like me and you, Darren, we talked last week about, you know, the pre-show, and I think, you know, we got to pool our money together and just buy us as a politician and just hold him accountable to what we want. You know, just like the corporations do, you know. And then again, I think about this country. Is voting, there is no choice. Like the architect said in the Matrix. There is no choice. They're already picked. You already know what's going to happen. They already know what's going to happen. All this thing has been going on, but nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. We've just changed the face in the White House. The ones that are really pulling the strings are behind the scenes pulling the strings, but we keep changing the faces every 4 to 8 years of a new person up there that we can point the finger at and say, he's doing wrong. But nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. We've been on course, the same course since we got our voting rights. Nothing has changed.
Okay, let me ask. Well, I disagree. I disagree. 50 years ago, you could roll up in somebody's house and string them up and nothing would happen. They would dare.
They did that to all through Gene, all through, what's his my man? They rolled up in his house, shot him dead. That chick is gonna get out of there. And they had to take her to court. Why didn't they just, that should have been open and shut. And what about my man George Floyd? Just killed my man in the street right on TV for us to see. For us to see a psychological thing that they did to us. That's modern day hanging. Nothing's changed.
Hold on. Actually, he got what, 22 to 25 years. And in the state of Minnesota, not one officer got that much time ever. And the one that closest did what happened to be of Somali descent. They let him out too, by the way.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know that.
The point is, you have to look at it because we don't put that pressure on there. Pressure makes diamonds. And we can't say that by doing nothing, that justifies the egregious activities of the oppressor. So again, like I said,
I'm not saying do nothing. I'm saying we got to figure out, we've been doing the same thing over and over again. We got to change something. I don't know what to change now. I just see that there's a problem and there's got to be something done about it because I feel we keep voting and voting and voting. Like I said, my man's given $6 billion to the Afghans. Two months ago, they were our enemies. 3 months ago, how many brothers and sisters and Americans died in Afghanistan? And now you're going to give them all this money to come over here?
But you know why reparations doesn't take hold? Because too many of us don't have the collective mass to get on the street. Now, there's roughly 40 million African Americans in the United States, for example, which constitutes 12 to 13% of the total population. You give me $1 million tax-free, you'll never see me again. So at the end of the day, if everybody thought that $1 million changed fundamentally their whole system, that's something that needs to be at least acknowledged. You know, I look at things out of the box. Let's, like in corporations, they do buybacks. You know what? Like I said, I have a number. You give me $3 million, you never see my black behind ever. I'll sign. I'll renounce my citizenship, but those are the type of activities that if we really, 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 really think that's something we want to do, we should have think tanks and come with a solution. I mean, because a lot of people are actually opting to leave, but if that's the case, I mean, that's something to me that should not be left off the table. You give me, I mean, I've been lucky to travel other places. You give me money to leave if I'm the problem, where you think I'm the problem, I'm out. Peace.
And I think he was trying to do that. He was trying to get a plan for a foundational black, and they just shot my man down. They just played games with him. It's disheartening, to deal with people that are snakes. And they've been throughout history. You've known that even the Indians are folks that they speak with forked tongue. Even back then. I just can't see being in a system like that, and you're being BS'd.
Okay, so let me ask the next question, because that's part of the past, but that can't be the prologue to the future. The changing demographics are what they are. And if we don't get back into the mindset futuristically of taking that power and running candidates, we're going to be in a situation, arguably, where the minority actually controls the majority. So again, from a voting question, how do we get into a cadence and rhythm that provides, one, the knowledge, and two, the energy to get people to come out? Because, by the way, in 2040, there's not going to be that majority that runs all of the shots, which is why, again, the goalposts are moving, the threats of violence are increasing, and the dissolution toward this experiment called democracy is beginning to erode the beliefs in our institution. How do we get there, guys?
I think if anybody can answer that question, you're gonna be a multimillionaire. How do we get the climate to change and people to vote more and to come out and to get into the right mentality? I think if we could solve that, we'd all be, Nobel Peace Prize winners and multimillionaires, because people would buy that formula. That's the whole key. We can discuss and discuss, but I don't think that we in the brotherhood, or we as a society, can come up with an answer, because it's like we just said prior to the show going. Everyone has an opinion and everyone wants to put their 2 cents in. But when things don't go their way, they bow out of it. Forget it. They throw their hands up.
I'm going to challenge that thinking. If you told, now think, just hear me out. 4 years ago, if you told me that the state of Georgia would elect a Jewish man and a black man, I would have looked at you as if you had horns coming out your head. But Stacey Abrams, after losing the gubernatorial election by just overt changing of the goalposts, the actual candidate happened to be the Secretary of State, who erased over 300,000 people off the rolls. Okay, she lost by less than a margin of 5 plus or minus 5%. You know what she did? Rather than complain and call the race card, which was evident, she went to work. And they created a ground game that was very specific, it was very targeted, and it turned out voters. So and trust me, so much so that the loser automatically went into fraud, which was the beginning in the embryonic stages of this big lie. So
you said it, Darren. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Okay.
You zeroed in, right? You got everybody to focus on this one thing, but that's microcosmic of what Bruce is trying to say. And I think Terry alluded to it. I don't think we're going to get back to where the church is the sole place, but I think we need to get back to a we and not a me mentality. Absolutely. I think, and so what Stacey Abrams did was, here is an agenda, but this is our community. You can control that. That's one state. How do you get all 50 states to agree on one agenda?
Okay, now here's where the electoral comes in, and I'll submit that to you. I still say, and right now, the fish is rotting at the head, or rotted at the head to get us to this point. Electorally, there's only 6 or 7. You use the Abrams blueprint. Right now, you got to look at a Michigan and even a Pennsylvania, where I happen to reside. Right now, immediately, when you look at just the loss in 2020 at the presidential election, they focused in on 3 cities, Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia, because that's where the concentration is. So we don't have to boil the ocean and trying to look at this. We've got to be what they call in statistics, we have to use some predictive analytics. We actually did it in 2020. Again, we turned people out. But going into 2022, if I had to look at it from a solutions-oriented perspective, we've got to get a commitment from everybody to vote. And, some other people, they say, holding your nose to vote. You got to do it. I mean, because at the end of the day, like I said, I think we all agree, we're going down a path where extremism is actually literally radicalizing the oppressor. And that's not acceptable from my end. So that's number one. We've got to get a commitment for people to vote. Number two, and I'm not saying Joe Biden's the candidate. I contend on a personal level, somebody needs to run against him in 2022 to see if there's something there, because I don't think he'll be successful in 2024, which means that we may very well be in the worse position than we were between 2016 and 2020 because we know that that guy is unqualified. They're like lowering the standard so an unqualified real estate agent can run the country again. You know, economically, did you know that the national debt went up 37% under this last president? And the top 1% were the recipients of an economic theory that doesn't even exist, which is trickle down economics. When does it trickle down to the poor and the disenfranchised and the people of color?
We still waiting for the Reagan trickle down effect. That ain't hit yet. And you know how long that was.
Exactly. So, you know, so when we talk about voting, you know, my appeal to just the masses would be to set a plan up. See, you know, I look at it very simple. If the vote wasn't that important, these people wouldn't be scrambling to do the things that they're doing to make it harder for you to cast that vote.
I agree with you, but I want to play devil's advocate. What in that makes me want to vote?
Say again?
What in what you said makes me want to vote?
Because in my opinion, again, and I'm a guy that looks at it from the political standpoint, we stand to be in a worse situation than we were today, because let's assume you let the same person that ran the country for 4 years get back in again. Now, I'm a student of personality. This guy's not a leader. There's a character flaw that makes this individual very vengeful, and he's not running to make the country better. I really believe that Obama had good intent. I really do. Now, whether or not he did it, that's up for debate. I really think that Biden had good intent. I think he's in over his head. I really believe.
Darren, let me interrupt you. I'm sorry. When you said Biden had good intent, what about in '93? Did he have good intent back then?
What, as far as the crime bill?
Yeah.
Well, here's the truth about the crime bill. And I can't speak to your neighborhood, but in my neighborhood, people were signing up for the crime bill. And here's my personal opinion, having lived in that environment. Some people did need to be put in cages and locked away forever. Yes. Yes.
And that, I'm going to go to where Terry said, and with that crime bill, they went into the church and got the churches to approve, to preach that to us as a people, the crime bill. That crime bill hurt us so bad, man, it's not even funny.
Well, as somebody, how do I say it nice? As somebody that, you know, could have made the same mistakes at some point, you know, that's how I want to frame it right. I had people telling me the predictive aspects of what was going on. You know, when people would say, you notice, Darren, we don't have boats, we don't have machine guns, make the right decision, son, because it's real easy for you to, you know, make these choices, but understand the occupational hazards, which I actually teach to some of these youngsters today, should they choose that. That's an occupational hazard that you need to be aware of. So if that's your bag, you have to understand that you inherit your mom, your kids, yourself in danger. And by the way, if you get caught and you can't bail yourself out, you're a failure in the game, you know, because you're supposed to make all this money. So before it even gets to that, you know, 3 strikes and you're out. You know what? I ain't gonna lie, I have a strike.
But you know what? Again, Darren, we weren't bringing the drugs in. We weren't doing none of that stuff. We weren't putting the guns in our neighborhood, like you just said. We weren't making the guns. It was a setup from the beginning. Give them the drugs, give them the guns, let them kill each other, and the rest we'll throw in jail. And then we're gonna make this 3-strike bill, and we'll get rid of the rest of them too.
But guess what? But if you look at it in the 50s, when the opioid crisis was upon us, I mean, I'll go back through the chronologic nature of just even drugs. Reefer Madness. If you ever watched that film, that was castigating people of color for smoking marijuana. Now it's legal. You know, so look at the disparities around that. But where I'm going is that even at that time, people were aware of what was going on, yet we still came together. So I can't look at a point in time in the 90s where people made decisions because it was new. I mean, again, I've always been conditioned that the social ills that affect our communities are one, disproportionate, and arguably have an origin outside of our, our making. And, so that's just the game. And at the end of the day, politically, people were telling, but remember, C. Dolores Tucker or some of these prosperity preachers, they got broken off. We all have a price. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but having lived in those areas, I mean, let's be honest, it destroyed neighborhoods and people were tired of it. New Jersey was the car theft capital of the world. I can only tell you what was going on in our neighborhoods, and what happened actually, when you look at the underside of it, it created a lot of vigilantes. I mean, when in our neighborhood, if you got caught, people took matters into their own hands. And that was worse because when you get tired, you're more willing to do things that probably are detrimental. Because if, let's say you break somebody's leg because you're tired, you know what? That hardworking person, they got caught up in the crime bill. But how did we stop that? You know what I mean? So
I think the bottom line comes down to, and we can all have these theories, and is one, you need to be informed. Darren, you are extremely educated when it comes to political views, to other things. A lot of people aren't taking that time. Like, for instance, you keep mentioning 2022 and how important that vote is, when it comes to, some people think every 4 years. It's like, I'm a track and field coach. Most of the country, most of the world only cares about track and field every 4 years because of the Olympics. But the world championships and things leading up to that, it's no big deal because they're not interested in it. That's why I really believe the same thing comes down to this whole voting thing.
Absolutely.
And it's only every 4 years because that's the face of the next America. Not the people that really make the laws, the congressmen and the senators, and not those people that really get it done. All they're looking at is the executive branch. So every 4 years. Other than that, it's leading up to those 4 years that is the most important vote. So I think education is the bottom line, that it needs to be, people need to learn. People need to become educated. And I think once the education level has risen and their political IQ has risen, not to be as deep as a political analyst that you could move into, but at least be aware of things or what's going on, little quick facts, so forth and so on, that could start to shift everything to a more positive and people going out to vote. But until that happens, it's every 4 years. And we're going to go, okay, we wanted the last president out because we all felt he was a nut and he was this and he was that. So we're going to go vote. But the whole political machine leading up to that stuff with Stacey Abrams and all that other stuff, people weren't really aware of that. They weren't really down because it didn't interest them.
Right.
That's
But
what
see,
it is.
but there's a correlation. And I remember someone asking me, well, why are you so involved with political? Everything is political. The cost of the meat that you eat on your table.
I'm not debating that. I'm not debating that at all. But what I'm saying is that you can come back with this, everything that's said, you can rebut or you can have a correlation with it. You can do that. But the bottom line, I really feel, in my opinion, some people don't give two plug nickels about what is going on out there. They don't care.
You're right. And
remember, there's people out there that are just trying to survive too.
Right.
Because the system that they're in, they don't have time to think about politics and stuff like that. And to go back to education, we're being educated by the political system. They've lied to us when you come out of your mother's womb and you're in that nursery, they sit you right in front of that TV and you're being brainwashed, right? You're being educated right there in front of that TV. So the education system, you have to educate yourself, or we have to get our own educational system, because that is a trap right there.
Fair.
Well, let me just say this here, right? In regards to politics, voting, and Black folks, there was a law that was instituted in the late 50s, early 60s called the Mumford Act. And the Mumford Act did two things. It took away your Second Amendment right, and it took away your right to vote. And that was in place because of the Black Panther Party, because they armed themselves and they threatened the police department that if you come in our neighborhood and you kill our people and you harm us, we're going to use these guns to kill you. You know, we have a right to defend ourselves, right? It was a politician whose name was Mumford. He created this act. He instituted this law. He wrote the bill and it became law. That's why Black young men began to get arrested and charged with felonies for the minute crime that in normal circumstances wouldn't be a felony. Because if you got charged with a felony, the Mumford Act would kick in. Now you can't own a firearm, and two, you can't vote until you get a certificate of relief. And most young Black men who go to jail, get arrested, or had a felony don't realize that you have the ability to vote. And if you don't know that, you can go to your local courthouse if you're no longer on probation or parole and get what's called a certificate of relief. If somebody deny you the right to vote, to prove that you can vote. And a certificate of relief is only granted after you're done with probation or parole. But these are things that's been put in place to stop us from voting, you know? And like you said, we're being brainwashed, because how many young Black men you know think that they can't vote because they've been arrested before? You know, and
tons.
So when you go out and try to tell them you can vote, a lot of people didn't realize they could vote. And a lot of these young Black men who went out and voted in the last president's election went out and voted because people will go out and say, no, you can vote. You can register, you can vote. They can't stop you from voting. So again, we have to educate our people on what we can and cannot do. We can no longer just toe the line and turn the other cheek. We have to be proactive.
Right.
So I guess, Terry, to bring that along to where Darren was going in terms of how do we get people to vote, because I think Bay brought up a interesting point in terms of people don't have time. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm probably not as into it as Darren is, but I love politics, right? So I understand local elections and all of that leading up to the every 4-year big election. But we grew up in a different era, right? We grew up with home economics taught in school. We grew up where all of those subjects were taught. And so that was part of our DNA. And to be quite honest, it was our outlet. You know, we didn't have TV. And so reading current events and learning about other places and understanding why America moved the way it moved was how I got into politics. And so when you talk about a generation who's been stripped of, you know, basic skills in school, right? And being taught to pass a state exam to graduate, how do we get those people back involved or get them involved in politics? Because then we can begin to have the discussion about what the agenda is and what we need to vote to move the needle.
Well, part of it is civics. I remember in maybe the 3rd or 4th grade, we had a class called civics, you know, and they kind of taught you the civic responsibility. Now, again, I may have been a rare breed. I had parents that were organizing, you know, from the 1968 riots on, you know, hearing message from the grassroots from Malcolm X. That was something that would be played, you know, on the turntable. So you're hearing these messages of, you know, getting together and doing for self, but also, you know, coming together. Now, for me, it's simple, because if we do nothing, those laws that Terry brings up, the Mumford Act, which, by the way, was enforced by Governor Ronald Reagan in California. You know, when we start talking about these voter suppression laws like poll taxes and literacy tests, they're being brought back, but just in a different way. So the only way you can offset that, again, is having that presence. And like someone else said, holding them accountable. We've got to start looking at these coalitions when these people run with the smiling faces and, you know, the advocacy group saying, what are you going to do before we pull that lever? That's the check and balance. And that's what has to happen. Now, for my politics, it's simple. I'm always going to vote. I voted in every election from the state level. I probably missed 2 or 3 local. I'm starting to go to school board meetings. I don't have children, but at the end of the day, I'm paying taxes. So I go there and I see the fact that right now, for example, in my small microcosm of the world, parents are starting to have issue or take issue to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Isn't that something? Now, the problem with that is that in some of these curriculums, the demographics are changing where these people that are against it aren't even the majority anymore. So when we say that it starts at the lower level, if that's what's going on at the school board level, that's tying to some of the nonsense I'm seeing at the national level when people are starting to have this grievance. For a country that's so great, we got a lot of people running around here with grievances. And when people have grievances that aren't really rooted in reality, that's when we have to look at it through the prism of history. That's when we have violence. That's when we have injustice. That's when we have nonsense. And we better figure a way, like I said, it's either 2 ways you can manage this, through armed struggle or through the process of electing leaders that are not trying to bring people together out. So, I mean, that's just how it is. And I can speak to different countries, different civilizations, and so on and so forth when we don't toe the line on trying to become more of a cohesive unit. And that's my biggest, that's what keeps me up at night, you know? And we have to plan for that. You know, I mean, at one point in the 60s, people were saying, you know, revolution, let's separate. You know, you had extremes on that end. That wasn't realistic at the time, but now what are we gonna do?
So
Well,
you mentioned something.
I kind of thought separation was good, segregation was bad.
Right. And guess what? Separation, believe it or not, is the unspoken truth of every successful ethnicity in America. They just don't choose to call it that. That's why there's a Koreatown. That's where there's a Greek town. That's where there's a Hebrew town, you know, and all of the other facets there, because they make an informed decision together to keep money within the community. And that's when, to Bay's point, they can get this politician because he's only sniffing around trying to get a job. So when he goes to Greek town, they say, listen, we need to make sure if we back you that you get commercial friendly zones in our neighborhood so we can build businesses. We need to make sure that we get a piece of some of that business when you have these revitalization plans and projects. So we have to step up too. So when I talk about voting, it isn't just me, it's we. But at the end of the day, the best thing you can do as an individual is exercise that right to vote, because they're doing too many things to jerk us around to not be able to do it.
How about this new thing they're doing with IDs, where, you know, the simple school ID you can't use to vote, you know? It's just unbelievable how if you don't have the standard state ID, such as a driver's license or passport, anything short of that, you really can't vote anymore in some of these states where they're doing all this gerrymandering and voting law changes.
And someone made the point around people that are just trying to survive. The combination of the price associated with a government ID coupled with where they're placing. Look at what's going on with the post office. That's an interesting case study, you know. That individual, DeJoy, was put in place to literally slow the mail, reduce the number of polling places, and that was done specifically to try to alter the outcome of an election when some old people are getting medicine and prescriptions from out of the country because it's cheaper, Some people rely on certain information like their pensions and they hand them out. So that just tells you, when we talk about the reason to vote, it's not just an African-American thing, by the way, because I still contend, unfortunately, there's a lot of people that are voting against their interests outside of, just people of color. People are willing to stay broke because they feel as though as long as no one else is getting ahead, that's fine by them. And that's another reason that we have to vote. That politician that's looking for equality, if equality is vetted out equitably, that's good for everybody. But what I'm seeing from a political standpoint is that people are willing to die because they can't believe on the efficacy of a mask. People are willing to stay broke because they believe the propaganda that they see on one channel and not the other. And we have to be bigger than that. It's a moral issue for me. It's not even politics. It's what's right.
So, guys, there's a question that came in, and it's how do we implement solutions to turn around the situation? And I think, Darren, you kind of alluded to it with the Chinatown and the Hebrew town. I think cooperative economics is where we need to start. I think that needs to be our new Black church.
Absolutely.
I think we need to pool our money and own areas and then demand respect. Because like Bay said, I think then you have the leverage to demand this get put on the agenda, right? And then like you said, we can move that. We become Stacey Abrams of North Carolina, of Wisconsin, of Milwaukee. We can begin to move, but I think without the cooperative economics, because that's where everybody's beating us, right? It's the reason why Biden signed an Asian bill and nobody has ever signed an African-American bill for violence. Like we've been abused for 500 years,
right?
But ain't nobody signed a bill. But the problem is we don't put our money where our mouth is in terms of owning and demanding respect.
And some of that is predicated on trust. We still have the psychological issues around being a unified group. Now, my personal politics aside, what I try to do or what my aspirations are is to help these young kids understand the value of net worth. It ain't about how much money you have. It's about net worth. I know people that earn millions but are still broke because they haven't figured out the concept of net worth. So that's number one. If we want to get into solutions, we have to understand and make these youngsters understand the concept of net worth. Okay. Now, unfortunately, there's a 10x gap between the net worth of people of color and the net worth of others. We have to look at ways to do that. A lot of it arguably is driven by systemic racism. That's something people don't want to hear, but that's the truth. If, like Terry alluded to, if you got a 500 year head start, it's going to take time to do it. But
That's
we
and
can change that.
Sorry. That's the ultimate form of affirmative action, is white supremacy and supremacy in this country. That's affirmative action,
But see, again, when we start attacking it, when we talk about this network thing, and I'll tie it into voting, we have to look at 49% of just Americans don't invest in interest-bearing investments. You can't, unless you marry in the money, unless you create a product or a service, or unless you are just highly successful in your field of endeavor, you're never going to put a dent in net worth if you don't make the income streams that you have work for you other than just staying where they're at, if that makes sense.
Well, one of the most important things that I teach my sons, I tell them, and I taught them this, I said, your wealth cannot be parked in your driveway or hanging in your closet. See, that's the problem with our children.
Correct.
They think that to feel successful, to feel good about themselves, they have to have the fancy car, the foreign car. They have to have all the Jordans in the world and all the jewelry to feel successful. They think that that's wealth. That's not wealth. That's stupidity. And we have to teach our children that generational wealth is what matters, and we have to teach them financial literacy to help them advance themselves, because we have to be able to hand down the information to the younger generations and help shape and mold their minds and stop letting pop culture do it, you know, and stop letting the Cardi B's and all them other people be the role models of our children. We have to be the role models of our children and teach them that it's important to vote down on the local level. Go to the school board, vote there. Start there. Vote in the folks. If you vote in the local elections, all those things is going to help change the national election. They all work hand in hand. You know, we have to teach them how to vote. We have to teach them about politics and financial literacy, because too many people, if you all look around the communities that you live in, right? The poorest communities have the most expensive cars. Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah.
The poorest communities have the most expensive cars. All the children go to school in the poorest schools with the most expensive tennis shoes on their feet. Why is that? You know what I mean? Because those parents are misguided. And somebody got to teach them. Because again, the crack era has ruined so many people and so many generations. But financial literacy have to be taught, as well as voting literacy and why we need to vote in order to make changes, some of the things that we have to implement as parents and people of color in America.
So it goes back to what I said, education.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Educate.
Exactly.
We need
Exactly,
to be educated.
Bruce.
And you know,
Because
not
they used to teach us, all of us were around the same age. Remember, we used to have to open up a bank account in school. We had to
Yep.
open up a bank account. We had home economics. The girls had home economics, sewing, cooking, all that. We had auto mechanics. We had that. They're not teaching, like Jerry said, they're not teaching anything practical anymore. And what Terry's saying is that's all the media feeding us all of that hype. Rich, or you get rich, I'll have this car. You gotta have these shoes. You gotta wear this clothes. You gotta wear these clothes. We're all taught that by the media. And parents don't have that time because they're trying to survive to feed these little kids.
Right.
You know, I'm not just, you know, it's everybody's responsibility as a community. You can't just say it's just the parent, it's everybody. The school board has to have a better curriculum so you can teach, you can raise decent human beings when the parents are not around. And when you send them home to the parents, look at what I learned today. I learned about a savings account. Remember, they taught us how to even make out a letter, to send a letter off.
right. Well,
You know, go ahead, Darren.
no, I was just going to say, and just one more case for voting, because voting is actually one of the cornerstones of an operating democracy. And what concerns me is that when I look at just certain other political ideologies, they're actually creating an environment that actually compromises the institutions that have not necessarily worked for us, but are there for us to exercise, if that makes sense. You've got people that believe that the last election wasn't even accurate. And there's a reason for that. So at some point, you know, once we stop believing in the democracy, warts and all, we open ourselves up to more authoritarian rule, which historically has not ever worked for the disenfranchised or the alienated, because that's an attempt by those in power to maintain power and do things that have no implications. 1933 Nazi Germany, as a matter of fact. So at some point, if we begin, and just my personal experience, when we begin to side with the oppressor's view of the world, we do ourselves a double disservice, because that's the trap that typically is laid. We can't ever go to that level of disenfranchisement, because, you know, basically that's just saying they're either scared or they are unwilling to make things fair. And that's just a historical lesson to be cognizant of.
They're definitely unwilling to make things fair. You know, they're not going to do anything that's fair. The country wasn't founded on anything fair. When they came over here, they weren't being fair.
So
You
now,
know,
so 9, maybe 10 generations later, we have a reckoning. So we either are going to collectively be a part of that change, or that change is going to be made for us, or we're going to devolve back into the same type of conflict that created it. And you know what? That's not off the table. I believe that, there are people, again, and I think I shared this in the pre-show when we were talking. I went to a protest for a different subject matter, but some yo-yos rolled up in there with AR-15s and AK-47s, and it was a peaceful protest. But that's where we're living.
But that's fair to them, Darren. That's what they call fair. As long as they have the advantage, that's what they call fair.
Right.
When you're in that situation that you were talking about.
But see, but that doesn't scare me, because I've seen, that I've been in those situations before. That doesn't scare me. Those aren't there aren't the only ones with weapons. But my point is, that's where we're going. And the only way that we can get justice, I'm willing to put it on the line for my personal beliefs. I'd only just hope that there would be justice righteously. But if we do nothing and we just let, people maintain the status quo, that just becomes, oh, okay, it happened and we accept it. There's always has to be a fight. If you're on the other end of fighting something, you can never give up. And we've never had that one unified, sustained position to say, this is where we need to move the needle. And I'll stop there.
And Darren, you're talking like a transfer of power. A transfer of power has never really been peaceful at all.
Correct.
You know what I'm saying? It's never been peaceful. And to take that amount of power from somebody is not going to be a peaceful thing. I'm not saying anything crazy. I'm just saying, when you look at that, transferring that amount of power, I don't know if that's going to be a click of a button, man. I don't know. So
maybe even bigger than voting, it has to be a level of cohesiveness that we have to have, in order to manage through that transition, because change is good, right. And again, we have to determine and be proactive in it. My biggest concern when I look at things historically is that when we put our minds together, we have made positive change. I look at the Montgomery bus boycott. 381 days, people found a way to bankrupt that bus company. And that required significant planning and commitment. And they had nothing to lose. They could have lost their jobs and they could have done that. But again, someone had the mindset to say, these folks are so lazy, they're not going to fire them because they're reliant on them. So, that had to be an awkward situation where you walk 4 miles to work and still serve these people, with the understanding that you were trying to uproot that system that was oppressing you, and we have to start looking at it through that lens. There's sacrifice associated with anything. And like I said, there are times I don't want to spend the time to understand the issues, but we have to figure it out. And both parties are going to hell in the handbasket, my personal assessment, but it's where you want to be. And again, it's the accountability issue. All of us, whoever voted for Mr. Biden, needs to be writing and using the avenues available. There's an app called 5 Calls. I use it regularly to talk to my congressman. Yeah, I get an answer or whatever, but I want them to know, just from my edification, look, I expect you to do this, 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 and that. And collectively, these races are getting close. And I don't know if it actually moves the needle, but you can't do nothing. Doing nothing is not an option in any endeavor. If you do nothing with your health won't give you the benefits that it's supposed to do. If you do nothing in trying to get justice, you'll get nothing. As a matter of fact, and I'll share this and be quiet. In California, a couple bought some property in California on the coastline. They were run off in 1924, right? Bruce's Beach, and they got run off. Finally, things were made right. The value of those 2 lots was $75 million. Because when they got run off, they didn't just accept it. Throughout the years, they fought it. And finally, so, we have to have that fight. And it's through voting, in my opinion. You don't win them all, obviously, but if you do nothing, there's a saying that an uncounted vote is a lost vote.
Well, and you know, Darren, that's your way of fighting, you know, what you're saying, and a lot of people have other ways of fighting too. We all don't fight the same way. We all
I
fight in
agree.
different ways, you know?
I agree.
So I guess that's where I was going, and I'm not trying to point any fingers, but how do we move a system if we're not a part of it? How do we change voting that doesn't work for some of us if all of us are not involved?
That's what Bruce, going back to what Bruce said, once you figure that out, that's Nobel Peace Prize area. That's what Bruce said earlier. So, you know, that's when somebody figures that out, man, I'm just looking at the problem. Like I said early on, I'm just looking, I see the problem. And that's the first step you take. You see the problem. Now you got to get the scholars, the scholars together, and they got to, let's figure this out, man. You know, that's where you got to go, you know? That's the way I look at it.
I look at, maybe I'm idealistic. You get a group of people that commit to voting and they choose a candidate. They go to that candidate. Now, I'm going to tell you why that's unrealistic just based on facts. We can't get an 80% attendance rate at open houses in public schools for our children. So we need to start there, because if you're not going to spend the time to get what's going on for the best interest of your children, the political scheme isn't even going to happen. So, Bruce, as a former teacher, so it starts there. I'm gonna push the needle for that. So first of all, if you get that groundswell of people at the local level that decide on a candidate, then you've got to tell that candidate, if you want to vote, you've got to come see us. And you list out doesn't have to be incredible, a 5-point plan, because across cities in America, those 5 points are going to be very similar. Equal opportunity, fair housing, better schools, cheaper prescription, but mean it, not just say it. And we're going to hold you accountable. So every month when you come back to our district, we're going to determine whether or not you're doing your job. And if you're doing your job, fine. But if you're not doing your job, we're going to have another candidate, and so on and so forth.
I agree with you, Darren. But like Bay said, what happens to that parent that's struggling, that can't make it because they're working 2 jobs, or their job doesn't allow them time to go vote, and or the time to go to that parent teachers conference. And so we've got to stop holding people to the fire for the wrong reasons. I get it. I absolutely think we all need to move into that, but we also got to look at the reality of the situation of the whole Black collective. We are not all at a point where I could punch out at 3 o'clock, make the 5 o'clock town hall, to voice my opinion, because my job starts at 4 o'clock.
If you can't make the meeting, you exercise email to make your point heard. If you can't be there to vote, you look at the opportunities in your municipality to either put in a mail-in ballot or vote absentee.
But you're going on the premise that people already know this. I'm talking about these millennials who are now struggling, who do not understand how to use the electronics that they own. I got people who are in their 20s working for me who don't know how to set an alarm on their phone to get up in the morning. But they got a $2,000 iPhone. And so we've got to go to where I work in healthcare and we do lean and we call it Gimba. We got to go to where the problem is. We have got to go to the millennials and figure out how and what is going to drive your interest to vote, and then help them get there. Not lay out this plan that works for us because that's how our ancestors did it, and it should work for everybody. It is not going to work for them. And so we've got to go and meet them where they are, figure out what it is that is their interest, and get them to vote, and show them how to vote. Show them the proper way to move the needle so that they don't have to work these customer service jobs trying to make a dead-end living, right? We've got to help them push the needle because they don't know any better. And it's the society that they live in now.
Well, my brother,
Man, that's the most I heard you talk since you've been on the show, Jerry.
And without getting into,
I'm going on mute.
And without getting into that on my personal page, I do that, my brother. I put stuff out there. Some folks don't like it. I don't care, because at the end of the day, I say, come speak to me because I'm gonna show you. I teach a man how to fish so he can catch his own fish. That way he ain't in my pocket asking me for a meal. So I agree with
I appreciate it because I see some of the stuff you put out. And then, you know, I've hit you and be like, hey, I really need some of your time because I want to learn to invest, but we're not all there yet.
That's true. That's true. So I think the collective thing, because we've only got 2 months, is that this voting thing, it's deeper than just a 90-minute conversation. And I think we all agree there's value in it. But I think, Jerry, you eloquently tied the bow to say, well, in order to do that, we've got to have outreach to our youth because they are the voting population, arguably, that's not fully registered, and we should all take provisions to try to optimize their output in the future. I think that was good, and we've got 1 minute to spare. Does anyone have a burning issue that they'd like to articulate before we sign off?
Again, I just really feel that it comes down to, you know, the bow on top of the present is to educate. You know, is to educate and to educate the millennials, the others, to educate them in the voting process, in the voting system, and to allow them to see that if we don't exercise our right to vote, then this could possibly happen. And if this possibly happens, it can be a direct correlation of us not getting out to vote. I think it's education.
Okay, brothers, it was a great conversation. It flew by, and I hope that everyone that's listened to us, they have a positive perspective of what we shared, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, man. Hope y'all invite me back.
All right.
All right. Later, guys.
All right.
It's rich. Sistahship, we got this on a brothership unite. Sistahship, we got this on a brothership unite. Sistahship, we got this on a brothership unite.